reading the scripture for us this morning. It's good to be with my church community today. I imagine that, like me, you might be wondering a lot these days, what the heck is the world coming to? You know the list as well as I do. Racial reckoning, bullying online, in the state and the state houses and congresses, in schools, gun violence that seems like it never ends, climate change. I could go on, and you, I'm sure, could add many things to that list. It feels like the fabric of our society is indeed fraying badly. And it also seems like this is a time when we need one another more than ever, when the solutions to these problems require cooperation, collaboration, and dare I claim it, actually loving our so-called enemies. Instead, we seem to be bound and determined to push one another away. And when I listen to the text that Tanya read from this perspective, I wonder if maybe Jesus and Paul felt somewhat the same way about the times that they were living in. They were living in a time of imperialism and abuse of power and privilege. And they were living in a time that even with the disciples in Jesus' case, and even in the early house churches, as Paul's case, both of which were meant as an antidote to the societal ills of the time, even in those circles, people needed to be reminded, how do we get along with each other? How do we build community together? How do we live? How really do we live peaceably with all? I'm not going to claim this morning that Lars has all the answers to these questions. I think the sweep of history tells us that movements come and go as well. And Lars is a movement in a sense that grew out of the 1960s. Which was a time of great social turmoil and upheaval and change in societies, not just here, but in Europe and other places around the world as well. And L'Arche is living into its 50-year history with all of the good and the bad of our past and our present. But for myself, my own journey in L'Arche, and the journey of one individual in particular that I want to share with you this morning, there are things that L'Arche can share about how to get along, how to live in community, how to see one another as human beings first, and how to grow and transform one another in the context of mutual relationship. It started for me with a simple invitation. I was out on the farm. My daughter was finishing up a service volunteer experience with her 4th grade class, and I was chatting with the farm manager as they were getting ready to get back on the bus. He said, "Have you ever thought about being on our board?" And I was taken aback. I said, no, no, I haven't, but that's an interesting question. I wonder. And so that's how it began for me. And at that time, I couldn't have imagined that 15 years later, I would be in my 6th year as community leader and executive director. So let me tell you a little bit more about what L'Arche is. We describe ourselves as communities of people around the world with and without intellectual and developmental disabilities, sharing life together in communities inspired by faith traditions, multiple faith traditions, and dedicated to the principle that true human depth of relationship is transformational between people with differences in particular. In the United States, large communities are also nonprofit organizations and state contracted human service providers. Here in Tacoma, L'Arche looks like 4 group homes, a farm, and a community center. I'm going to let Cindy, one of our residents, introduce you through a video that we created about this time last year for an event that we call L'Arche Fest. We're not having that event this year, but the video is still a great introduction to L'Arche.
My name is Cindy and welcome to the L'Arche Fest.
It's the Welcome Center. This is our new building. We just had it built a couple years ago. This is L'Arche Honor Room. Secret Heart gave us this house. Welcome to Adonda. It's almost Halloween and we're setting things up, and I hope that the rest of you guys have a nice Halloween. It's really beautiful at the farmhouse. It's gorgeous. Look at the trees. Look at the yard and everything. Hi, welcome to our farm. We grow together and we'll be together. This is the L'Arche Chapel, and we have people coming into chapel to pray, to write notes. This is the training center. This used to be an office. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Home Spring.
Well, that's a little bit about what we look like on the outside in all of our spaces and places that we are throughout the days, and in all of our different ways that we are able to participate in welcoming people. Yeah, one of the reasons, Dawn, that I got involved in L'Arche, I'm reading the comments as they come up, is because it made me smile from start to finish. So there you are. Doesn't always make me smile, but when I get to see it a little bit from that outside perspective, the smile comes back. So going back to how my story started, in order to come to L'Arche and in order to come to this role in L'Arche, had to be open. And I think that is lesson number 1 of community, is openness to whatever and whoever is going to come into our lives. It's a little bit like a family and not like a family. So it's like a family because you don't pick your family, right? And some people do have to leave their families for very good reasons. Their families of origin are not a healthy place for them sometimes for their whole lives. That is actually true at L'Arche as well. People come and go. And part of the coming and the going is being open to who they are as they come, who they become when they're with us, and then being open to letting them go. I think Cindy's story about coming to L'Arche is also one of openness. Cindy grew up just down the street from the L'Arche community. She went to Franklin Pierce schools, and she lived with her mom for a very long time. And as her mom aged, Cindy felt a lot of responsibility to take care of her mom. And even after she moved into Ananda, she went home every weekend to be with her mom. And she would describe the day that struck terror in my heart was the day that mom fell and Cindy couldn't get her up and didn't know what to do. And so for Cindy, coming to L'Arche, a place of safety, it meant opening herself up to a whole different way of living in a house with other people for whom that she was actually not responsible. Cindy struggled a lot with what is my role here when she came. She has so many abilities and is such a people person, but it isn't Cindy's job to manage someone else's behavior or to help someone else get dressed or to take someone on a walk without letting someone know that you're leaving. And so Cindy's openness to change was an important part of Cindy becoming seeing herself as a full member of the community with gifts to offer. Cindy's been in the community a little bit longer than I have, so about 7 years now. And I think that her being able to do that video is testament to the fact that she had a strong relationship with the person who was helping her, that she has a phenomenal memory, that she wants to welcome people and wants to use her gift of bringing people in and being open to meeting other people. We also had to be open to Cindy's gifts. So people don't reveal themselves right away. You probably know this from your own relationships, right? Even those of us who've been in long-term romantic relationships can still be surprised. And so part of the delight of openness is being open to the surprises. The surprises are not always fun surprises. It is challenging for Cindy to manage her diet in a way that allows her to live life to the fullest and be healthy. Anybody out there have that problem too? Yeah. So part of the openness that we experience in L'Arche in committing to relationship with one another is we commit to learn the hard stuff about ourselves at the same time. So the people who come to L'Arche who offer care to our residents are often young people in their 20s, not always, but often. And they always describe their journey in L'Arche as one of self-discovery, as much as discovering the gifts of other people. They discover their own gifts, they discover their own challenges, they discover their own weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And in that context of community and caring for each other, they discover how to hold those things for themselves, how to be at peace with that part of themselves. Cindy has that's been Cindy's journey, that's been my journey, and that is the journey of many of the caregivers who come to L'Arche. The second lesson that I want to talk about is a willingness to live with unresolvable tensions. This is something that the idea of this was entirely new to me. There are always ways that we can learn and grow together. There are always ways that we can discover each other's gifts and strengths and challenge one another. But there are always tensions in community that are not resolvable. And in fact, sometimes I would submit that's a good thing, because we continue to learn and grow, and it creates a creativity. It builds our creativity as we try to navigate those tensions together. One example I would give is that people with disabilities are caught in a web of bureaucracy that is sometimes incomprehensible, often dehumanizing, and doesn't change overnight, if it changes at all. And for me, learning about that system and learning what it offers and what it limits has been both heart-wrenching and extremely frustrating. There are things that people need to live a full life that are not provided in the systems that we have for people with disabilities. And for those folks who don't live in a place like L'Arche, who is willing to go the extra mile, who has the opportunity to fundraise, who can bring many, many resources to bear for people's lives, it's painful to think about how restrictive and limiting our systems can be. We also have internal tensions that we live in. There is a tension around who's more, I don't want to really say who's more important, but it really reminded me of this story that Jesus told. It's the needs of the caregiver and the needs of the person being cared for. There's a power dynamic there that's unresolvable. The caregiver always has more choice, more opportunity in that relationship, that caregiving relationship. But the person being cared for also has agency, also has power, and also has needs that don't solve themselves, needs that require another person to help them. And so there's a tension of, how do I take care of myself so that I can take care of others? There's a tension of, my needs are not being met, so then how can I meet the needs of others? There's a tension of, is every hour that I give as a caregiver a paid hour? Is every hour I spend with a person in my community with disabilities a paid hour? Where is the space for companionship, friendship, and simple giving of oneself if the caregiver doesn't feel cared for themselves? So that's a tension that we live in and we struggle with, and we balance in some ways, we fail in other ways. But I think Jesus' story here really, it just makes me smile to imagine these two disciples coming to Jesus and saying, hey, we're more important than everyone else. Affirm that, please. And I feel sometimes that way as a leader in L'Arche, that people come to me and they want to be affirmed their need as more important than other people's. And it takes some reframing, and it takes some reminders, like Jesus gave the disciples. Hey, well, are you really willing to walk this difficult road? And then it takes a little bit of mystery of, I don't have all your answers. Jesus, I love this. He says, I am to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to grant. Huh? So even Jesus didn't resolve all the tensions with his disciples. He tried to guide them and say, you know that what we're building here together, this community that we are building together, is meant to be different than the way people in our general society treat one another. And so you are called to not treat each other in that way. You are called to not ask for being set aside and set apart and better than others. And Paul, he references a similar thing. He talks about, don't think of yourself as don't be haughty, he says. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to. Don't be conformed to this world, be transformed. And so I think that this is something that in our wider societal community, when we look to our leaders to resolve everything, it's not likely to go well for everyone. If that's the case, we have to put our own strengths and our own gifts and our own challenges on the table as individuals, and not expect that of a leader, and also not expect everything will be resolved in the end. Finally, I want to talk about the third lesson that I've gained so much from. And it's something that I think this church community does so very well. Witnessing and walking with one another, and particularly in the painful and the hard times. I'm going to go back to Cindy for a moment. Since Cindy moved into L'Arche, her mother has passed away, and her brother and another family member. That's left Cindy with her sister and her nephew as her only family outside L'Arche. When Cindy's mother died, it was really, really hard for her. Remember, she had seen herself as her mother's caregiver. They were very close. So the L'Arche community came together for Cindy we went to the memorial service. We were there for her. We were introduced to the nephew and the friends and the church family that Cindy had at that time. And we were there to stand with her and to listen to her as she talked about what she missed about losing her mom. A little while later, not that long, maybe a year, Cindy's brother died. And actually, the brother died before the mother, now that I think about this. Sorry about that. Got that in the wrong order. It wasn't entirely clear what would be appropriate to memorialize her brother. He wasn't a church-going person. And we ended up having a little memorial service in our little tiny chapel, which Cindy's family came to. And we celebrated her brother's life together in that way. It will always be one of my favorite memories of L'Arche, of how we supported Cindy through those deaths and how it gave her permission to grieve with and to feel supported and to further feel her sense of belonging as part of the community. There are other ways that we witness and walk with one another in L'Arche. We have learned a lot on this journey of welcoming people of many gender identities. And one of the things that has touched me a lot is if your value is around mutual relationship and you want to reach across difference, you have to be willing to acknowledge someone else's pain about something that you don't feel that connection to. You might not feel that emotional connection to. We've had a lot of conversation in our community about pronouns. And I know for some people, they just don't get it. It's like, what is the big deal? I don't see why I should have to declare my gender identity when I introduce myself, for example. And I've listened and listened along this, and I've been all over the map. But really, I think where I began to change on that particular issue is the way that it touches people with pain when the wrong pronoun is used. It comes down to that most human feeling of, you don't see who I am, you don't value what I value, I don't belong here. Well, that doesn't seem quite like what we want to foster in L'Arche, does it? We are hopeful that we can be a place of belonging for a lot of people coming from different backgrounds with different identities and different needs and desires and joys in their lives. And so I had to learn to listen differently and go on that journey with them and understand why this is important to them and adopt it for myself in a way that I don't know that I would have come there without witnessing that painful journey and allowing it to change me. Jesus says, are you going to walk with me? Are you going to drink the cup that I have to drink? The disciples, oh yes, oh yes. Do they really know what he means by that? Well, of course not. We know from later on in the Gospels and from how we observe our church here that there's much harder stuff to come. And they had to also recognize that they had to change in order to honor who Jesus was in his life and the journey that he was going to need to travel. So these relationships that we try to build in L'Arche, these relationships of mutuality, they are transformational. But I don't, again, want to come back. I want to come back to that idea of I'm not trying to put L'Arche on a pedestal. I think we all learn these things in different community contexts when we are willing to be open, when we are willing to live in tensions and explore them creatively, and when we are witnessing and walking with each other through the painful and the joyful parts of our lives. It doesn't take L'Arche to get you there, but L'Arche is a kind of a crucible for that. And I have a lot of gratitude for the honor and the opportunity of being a part of that community and having the opportunity to shepherd it into whatever it's going to become next on our journey.